Welcome to our channel, where history lives and breathes through powerful stories that shaped the world. Today, we dive into the Tudors and their impact on modern society, exploring how this iconic dynasty shaped law, culture, and governance, leaving a lasting legacy still felt across Britain and beyond. Let's begin. The Tudors and their impact on modern society, how they shaped law, culture, and governance. Part 1. Foundations of Tudor Authority. The rise of the Tudor dynasty in 1485 marked a turning point in English history. With the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor's victory ended the Wars of the Roses and established a new royal lineage that would shape the nation's future. The consolidation of power under Henry VII laid the groundwork for a more centralized and assertive monarchy. Unlike his predecessors, Henry VII focused on stability through strong governance rather than military conquests. He understood that legitimacy had to be continually reinforced through both legal mechanisms and symbolic displays of authority. This shift in royal strategy deeply influenced the evolution of government institutions in England. One of Henry VII's most enduring contributions was the expansion of the Royal Council and its increased reliance on trained administrators rather than noble-born advisors. This subtle restructuring of power began the process of bureaucratization that characterizes modern statecraft. The King's Council evolved into a body of professionals, lawyers, clerks, and scholars who laid the early framework for administrative government. This development reduced the power of feudal lords and helped align the monarchy with educated elites loyal to the crown. The balance of power tilted away from hereditary privilege and toward merit-based appointment, a principle still echoed in modern civil service systems. Henry also used fiscal policy as a tool of political control, creating the Court of the Star Chamber and other financial institutions that allowed the crown to bypass traditional parliamentary constraints. By asserting financial independence, the Tudors reduced their reliance on noble support and increased royal autonomy. This strategic distancing from feudal obligations would influence the way modern governments handle taxation, budgeting, and sovereign control over public funds. Though controversial in its time, the centralization of royal finance helped develop early notions of institutional accountability and financial governance. Symbolism played a powerful role in establishing Tudor authority. The Tudor rose became more than a floral emblem. It was a visual statement of unity, combining the houses of York and Lancaster. Portraits, pageants, and printed propaganda were deliberately employed to solidify the image of a strong, divinely sanctioned monarchy. Henry VII. A cautious but deliberate use of media signaled an early understanding of public perception in governance. Today, as political branding and visual communication strategies owe part of their origin to such Tudor innovations in image control, marriage alliances were another calculated move in Henry VII's consolidation of power. By marrying Elizabeth of York, he joined two warring factions, thereby strengthening the legitimacy of his rule. Later, strategic marriages for his children helped secure international alliances and domestic peace. This use of dynastic marriage as a diplomatic tool foreshadowed the modern practice of political alliances built on soft power rather than brute force. It also embedded a culture of strategic planning at the highest levels of governance that persists in, today, COS foreign policy decisions. Henry VII's cautious but visionary reign created an atmosphere in which authority was not only exercised, but institutionalized. He transformed personal monarchy into structured governance, making the crown not just a symbol, but an enduring part of national identity. This was a crucial step in the evolution of the state from a personal fiefdom to a system guided by rules, offices, and procedures. Modern constitutional monarchies and executive branches can trace aspects of their organizational DNA back to this formative period. The Tudor approach to law and order also laid early groundwork for national unity. Under Henry VII, local justices were more closely monitored, and royal law was extended deeper into the provinces. This created a more consistent legal environment, reducing the influence of regional lords and feudal jurisdictions. It was a precursor to the standardized rule of law that underpins modern legal systems. The monarch's relationship with Parliament, though still one-sided, began to change subtly during the early Tudor period. Henry VII used Parliament sparingly but skillfully, summoning it to legitimize key decisions, especially concerning succession and taxation. This strategic engagement marked the beginning of a more formalized legislative process. While absolute royal control would later be challenged, these early steps laid the foundation for the evolving role of legislative bodies in governance. The shift from personal monarchy to institutional monarchy was not merely a matter of power, it was a matter of legacy. By redefining kingship as both a divine duty and an administrative responsibility, the Tudors introduced an enduring concept of statecraft. This model would serve as a prototype for later European monarchies and even modern democratic systems that emphasize checks and balances, institutional stability, and leadership accountability. What began with Henry VII's cautious, calculated rule would echo across centuries of governance and reform. Thus, the foundation of Tudor authority was not built solely on conquest or charisma, but on deliberate structural changes in governance, law, and symbolism. These early innovations shaped the trajectory of England's political development and remain embedded in the principles of modern statecraft. The legacy of Henry VII's reign is visible not just in history books, but in the everyday operation of courts, councils, and cabinets across the world today. Part 2. Centralized Monarchy and Legal Reform. The reign of Henry VIII brought a dramatic transformation in the structure of English governance. His assertion of supremacy over the church and his far-reaching reforms in state administration marked a turning point in how power was centralized and exercised. The break with Rome in 1534 was not merely a religious act but a constitutional revolution. It placed the monarch at the apex of both secular and spiritual authority, reshaping the balance of governance across the realm. This move established a precedent for national sovereignty in legal and religious matters. No longer would foreign ecclesiastical powers influence English law or social norms. The Act of Supremacy made it clear the king was the ultimate authority in all domains within his kingdom. Such declarations of national jurisdiction laid the groundwork for later legal systems grounded in parliamentary sovereignty and independence from supranational influence. The legal reforms that followed were swift and expansive. The Reformation Parliament, summoned between 1529 and 1536, passed laws that altered the very fabric of the English state. Canon law was displaced by royal ordinances, and monasteries, long autonomous and powerful institutions, were dissolved and their lands seized. This dramatic redistribution of land and wealth did more than enrich the crown. It empowered the rising gentry and tied them to royal governance. By binding local landowners to the fortunes of the crown, Henry VIII secured their loyalty and reinforced central control. These shifts diluted the remnants of feudal power and created a new socio-political order where governance was no longer solely aristocratic. Instead, it began to depend on professional administrators, educated in law and increasingly secular in orientation. This transformation introduced the concept of governance by expertise, a trait visible in modern civil services around the world. Perhaps one of the most consequential legal transformations was the development of a unified English legal identity. Through a series of acts and proclamations, Henry VIII extended royal law into regions that had previously enjoyed significant autonomy. This included efforts to incorporate Wales into the legal system of England via the laws in Wales Acts of 1535 and 1542. These acts erased many regional distinctions and created a more integrated legal structure, setting a model for national unification through codified law. The idea that law could be used not only to punish but to unify and restructure society became a defining feature of Tudor governance. Henry VIII's government did not shy away from using statutes to redefine religious practice, marriage norms, or loyalty to the state. The Treason Acts in particular broadened the definition of disloyalty to include speech and belief, tools of social control that would echo in later legal codes throughout Europe. Such laws showed how deeply the state could entrench itself in both public and private life through legal mechanisms. Despite their authoritarian nature, these legal instruments contributed to the standardization and formalization of legal processes. They required written documentation, official seals, and administrative oversight, which spurred the expansion of record-keeping and clerical training. These developments laid the foundation for modern legal institutions that rely on documentation, precedent, and transparency. The judiciary was still under royal influence, but its procedures were becoming more consistent and institutionalized. Another hallmark of Tudor legal transformation was the move toward a common law that applied uniformly across regions. While the roots of English common law predated the Tudors, it was under Henry VIII that its application became more pervasive and coherent. Royal judges traveled more regularly to enforce the king's laws, ensuring that local courts could no longer operate with unchecked autonomy. This development helped define the relationship between national and local justice, a theme central to modern legal systems. Through these changes, the idea of the rule of law began to evolve. No longer was the monarch's will seen as arbitrary decree. It now had to be justified, recorded, and ratified through formal legal structures. While England was far from being a constitutional monarchy at this stage, these early Tudor innovations foreshadowed later developments in the limitation of royal power. What emerged was the notion that even kings needed laws to govern effectively, a belief that would eventually underpin modern democratic states. Henry VIII's legal reforms also had profound social consequences. The dissolution of monasteries, for example, displaced thousands of monks and nuns, but also opened opportunities for laypeople in administration and land ownership. This created new economic dynamics and shifted societal norms about religious authority, community leadership, and wealth distribution. The impact extended beyond the elite, gradually shaping a society more accustomed to state intervention and legal regulation. While these legal transformations were often harsh and uncompromising, they forged the legal architecture of the modern British state. By centralizing power, extending legal uniformity, and using the law to redefine authority, Henry VIII's regime laid a blueprint for future governance. Modern systems of national jurisdiction, centralized law enforcement, and government accountability all carry traces of these Tudor-era innovations. The Tudor transformation of law was not merely about the crown asserting control. It was about redefining the role of law in society. From political unification to the standardization of justice, these reforms established principles that continue to influence legal institutions to this day. What began as royal power consolidating itself became, over time, a model of lawful governance that shaped the constitutional frameworks of future generations. Part 3. Religious Reforms and Cultural Shifts. The Tudor era introduced a seismic shift in religious practice across England, altering centuries-old traditions in a matter of decades. Under the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary Lermer, and Elizabeth I, England witnessed a religious tug-of-war that redefined spiritual life and social identity. These transitions were not just theological disputes. They fundamentally restructured the cultural framework of the nation. They changed how people worshipped, how they educated their children, and how they understood authority. The initial rupture came with Henry VIII's break from the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s. What began as a personal desire for annulment evolved into a radical assertion of national ecclesiastical independence. The establishment of the Church of England, with the king at its head, marked a clear departure from papal authority. This declaration reshaped the spiritual allegiance of the English people, redirecting loyalty from the Pope to the Crown. Though Catholicism remained deeply rooted in the hearts of many, Henry's suppression of monasteries signaled a point of no return. Monastic institutions, along the centers of charity, learning, and local identity, were closed or destroyed. This upheaval did more than demolish religious buildings. It removed community anchors and redistributed their wealth to secular elites. The cultural landscape was upended, and with it, the rhythms of daily life that had revolved around church bells, feast days, and monastic care. Religious reform accelerated under Henry's son, Edward IV, whose short reign pushed England firmly toward Protestantism. Church services were now held in English rather than Latin. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced, and iconography was purged from places of worship. These changes were designed to make faith more accessible, but they also stripped away generations of visual and ceremonial tradition. People who once found spiritual comfort in the rich imagery of saints and relics now faced bare walls and unfamiliar liturgies. The cultural backlash came swiftly with Mary the Warren's ascension in 1553. A devout Catholic, she reinstated papal authority and persecuted Protestants in an effort to restore the old faith. Her actions earned her the moniker Bloody Mary, and while she briefly re-established Catholic rights, her reign deepened religious divisions. Hundreds were executed, churches were rededicated, and fear swept across the land as subjects learned the cost of theological dissent. But it was Elizabeth VIII who forged the most enduring religious compromise. Her Elizabethan religious settlement in 1559 aimed to unify a fractured nation without inflaming either Catholic or Protestant passions too deeply. She retained many Catholic traditions in ritual and appearance, but ensured Protestant theology remained the core of national worship. This balance allowed the Church of England to become a uniquely English institution, neither wholly Catholic nor fully Reformed. Elizabeth's policies helped stabilize society and gave rise to a shared religious identity, one that would influence national culture for centuries. By creating a moderate and distinctly English church, she ensured that religion would support, rather than undermine, the state. Church attendance became a civic duty, reinforcing loyalty to the crown while also fostering a sense of communal unity. In this environment, sermons doubled as moral lessons and political instruction, linking personal piety with public order. The religious transformations also influenced education. With monasteries gone, new schools were founded under Protestant ideals, emphasizing literacy, scripture reading, and critical thought. The proliferation of printed Bibles and religious texts brought literacy to new segments of the population, especially the emerging middle classes. As people learned to read for religious reasons, they began to explore other forms of literature, laying the groundwork for the English Renaissance. Language itself was affected by religious reform. The translation of religious texts into English enriched the vernacular, introduced new expressions, and standardized grammar and usage. Phrases from the Book of Common Prayer and the King James Bible became woven into everyday speech. The religious upheaval thus not only reshaped belief, it also helped form the English language as we know it today. Religious reform also inspired artistic and intellectual shifts. Although Protestantism was suspicious of visual representation in worship, it encouraged other forms of expression. Poetry, music, and literature flourished under Elizabeth. The moral themes and religious anxieties of the time found their way into the works of playwrights, philosophers, and thinkers. Artists like William Byrd composed sacred music that complied with Protestant theology but retained emotional and aesthetic depth. The Tudor religious transformation created a complex legacy, one that was both painful and profound. It forced people to reconsider authority, community, and conscience in ways that would echo into modern times. Even today, the English attitude toward religious tolerance, national identity, and secular governance can be traced back to these foundational reforms. While these shifts were driven by monarchs, they were absorbed and reshaped by the people themselves. The Tudor religious experience was not a single doctrine imposed from above. It was a negotiation between ruler and subject, belief and law, tradition and change. That negotiation continues to shape the British understanding of faith and public life to this day. Part 4. Tudor Education and the Rise of the Modern School System. The Tudor dynasty. As influence extended far beyond politics and religion, it laid the groundwork for the modern educational system in England. Education, once the privilege of the church and aristocracy, became increasingly accessible during the Tudor period due to new priorities in governance, religion, and social mobility. This transformation reshaped not only how people learned, but why they learned, forever altering English society's approach to knowledge and self-improvement. Prior to the Tudors, most formal education in England was tied to the church. Monasteries served as centers of literacy and learning, teaching Latin grammar, biblical studies, and theology to future clerics and a small group of elite boys. With the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, these traditional centers of learning disappeared almost overnight. The gap they left behind prompted new educational models to emerge, many supported by the crown or local gentry rather than religious orders. Henry VIII, despite dismantling monastic schools, recognized the value of an educated class for governance and religious reform. He authorized the creation of grammar schools to replace lost institutions, often endowing them with funds seized from the church. These grammar schools focused on teaching Latin, rhetoric, and logic, skills considered essential for future statesmen and church leaders alike. Education thus became a tool of statecraft, nurturing a generation of administrators loyal to the crown and capable of managing its growing bureaucracy. Under Edward VI, Protestant leaders promoted education as a way to spread religious reform. Reading the Bible was considered a moral duty, and literacy was vital for religious self-sufficiency. As a result, many schools introduced religious texts in English, moving away from purely classical instruction. The idea that all people, not just priests, should understand Scripture marked a revolutionary shift in educational purpose. Mary D's short reign saw a brief return to Catholic educational models, but her successor, Elizabeth I, re-established Protestant principles in education. Her government supported a wide network of parish schools, where boys learned to read, write, and recite Protestant catechisms. These small, often locally funded schools brought basic education to towns and villages that had never seen formal instruction before. The availability of schooling, though still limited, was becoming more widespread than ever before in English history. The Tudor period also saw the rise of public or free grammar schools, which charged no tuition and admitted talented boys regardless of social background. Endowed by wealthy patrons, these schools provided education to the sons of merchants, artisans, and lesser gentry. This access allowed a broader segment of society to rise through the ranks of government, the church, or academia based on merit rather than inheritance. It signaled the early stages of a meritocratic society, though still firmly limited by gender and class boundaries. Higher education likewise evolved under Tudor influence. Oxford and Cambridge universities remained dominant, but they shifted to accommodate the new religious order and administrative needs of the state. The curriculum became more standardized, focusing on Protestant theology, law, and classical learning. Colleges founded or re-endowed during this period, such as Trinity College, Cambridge, embodied the fusion of old traditions and Tudor reformist ambition. Education for women, while still restricted, saw slight improvement during the Tudor era. Noblewomen and daughters of the gentry were increasingly taught to read and write, often in English rather than Latin. This literacy enabled women to manage estates, write letters, and read religious texts, skills that enhanced their roles in domestic and social life. Figures like Elizabeth I, highly educated in multiple languages and philosophies, became powerful examples of intellectual capability in women. Books and printed materials became more widespread thanks to the printing press, introduced to England in the late 15th century but popularized under Tudor patronage. Printers like William Caxton and later Richard Grafton flourished under royal license, producing grammar books, religious tracts, and educational manuals. With more texts available in English, literacy spread beyond elite circles to include merchants, artisans, and urban dwellers. The printed word not only facilitated learning, but also fostered a shared cultural and national identity through standardization of language and ideas. Education under the Tudors was never neutral. It was a reflection of political and religious agendas. Boys were groomed to serve church or state, and the content of their education was carefully crafted to reinforce obedience to the crown. Yet, even within these boundaries, the acquisition of knowledge became a pathway to personal advancement and civic participation. The notion that a citizen should be educated to contribute to society began to take root during this era. This transformation from cloistered clerical instruction to widespread lay learning marked a turning point in English history. The seeds planted by Tudor education reforms blossomed in later centuries, feeding into Enlightenment thinking, democratic governance, and mass education movements. The emphasis on literacy, moral instruction, and state service foreshadowed the modern public school system we recognize today. Though limited by the prejudices of its time, excluding girls, the poor, and nonconformists, the Tudor vision of education nonetheless reshaped society from the ground up. It created a foundation for intellectual growth, civic awareness, and national unity that continues to inform English identity and institutions. Part 7. Social mobility and the changing class structure. The Tudor era marked a critical transformation in English society, where rigid medieval hierarchies began to loosen under economic and political change. While nobility still held considerable power, the rise of a prosperous merchant and professional class redefined what it meant to ascend socially. This period set the stage for the modern British class system, where wealth, education, and service to the crown could elevate status beyond birthright. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII played a pivotal role in this shift. Thousands of acres of church land were seized and redistributed, often sold to private individuals loyal to the monarchy. This sudden redistribution created a new class of landowners, many of whom had once been merchants or minor gentry, who now held substantial rural influence. These new landowners, sometimes called the New Men, became crucial allies of the Tudor regime. They provided revenue, enforced royal policies locally, and occupied key administrative roles. In exchange, they were rewarded with titles, offices, and growing legitimacy within the traditional elite. The expansion of trade, particularly through the London-based guilds and trading companies, gave urban merchants increased financial and social clout. Ports like Bristol, Norwich, and York developed thriving commercial hubs, and successful merchants began to rival lesser nobles in wealth. These individuals often sought to buy land or marry into the aristocracy, solidifying their rise through strategic social investments. Education also became a powerful tool of mobility. Tudor grammar schools were established across the country, sometimes sponsored by monarchs, sometimes by civic benefactors. These institutions offered Latin, rhetoric, and philosophy, skills that opened doors to the clergy, the law, and royal bureaucracy. Ambitious young men from modest backgrounds could, through education, enter Oxford or Cambridge. Once there, they trained as clerks, lawyers, or ministers, professions which offered real roots into the corridors of influence. This educated class served as judges, secretaries, tutors, and scribes, shaping the machinery of Tudor governance. Women's roles in mobility remained more constrained, but some avenues did exist. Daughters of wealthy families could make powerful marriages or serve in noble households, gaining patronage and influence. A few exceptional women, such as Bess of Hardwicke, used marriage, estate management, and court connections to become wealthy and powerful in their own right. The growth of royal bureaucracy expanded the demand for capable administrators. These jobs, once reserved for the aristocracy, were increasingly filled by educated commoners loyal to the crown. They became the backbone of Tudor governance, often rising through merit and earning lifelong income and prestige. This reshaped class structure also had cultural effects. Portraits, heraldry, and literature increasingly featured non-noble subjects asserting their identity and accomplishments. Writers like William Shakespeare, himself from a modest background, highlighted the complexities of status, ambition, and merit in their work. The evolving class system was not without tension. Older nobility sometimes looked down on the newly rich, whom they saw as lacking pedigree and refinement. Conflicts occasionally erupted over precedence, rights, and social decorum, particularly at court or in local governance. The Tudor state used these tensions to its advantage. By balancing old aristocracy with emerging gentry and merchant classes, the monarchy maintained control and prevented any single group from becoming too dominant. This diversification of power ensured loyalty through opportunity, not just bloodline. Economic mobility also came with vulnerability. The enclosure movement, privatizing common lands, often favored landowners but displaced rural peasants. While some prospered by leasing or investing, others lost access to farmland, leading to urban migration and growing poverty in towns. In response, Tudor governments passed poor laws and labor statutes to manage the urban poor. They distinguished between the deserving and undeserving poor, those who couldn't work due to age or illness, and those deemed idle or vagrant. These laws reflected changing attitudes about responsibility, work, and the role of the state in social order. Guilds also struggled to maintain control over economic life as capitalism began to outpace medieval regulations. While some protected their members' interests, others became exclusionary or inflexible, limiting opportunities for newcomers. This struggle between tradition and innovation defined the lives of many working craftsmen and traders. Despite challenges, the Tudor period established pathways to mobility that would shape English society for centuries. It redefined success, not merely as birth into noble blood, but as achievement through education, service, and economic acumen. The seeds planted by the Tudors grew into a society where middle-class values and ambition would increasingly guide public life. Modern British notions of meritocracy, professionalism, and social aspiration owe much to these Tudor foundations. By rewarding talent and loyalty across class boundaries, the monarchy helped forge a more dynamic and complex social fabric. Though not fully egalitarian, Tudor England moved away from the static feudal model toward a more open, if still unequal, society. Part 8. Religion and the Shaping of English Identity. The Tudors revolutionized religious life in England, and in doing so, reshaped the nation's very identity. Faith was no longer just a private matter. It became a tool of political authority, cultural alignment, and national unity. This transformation began with Henry VIII's break from the Roman Catholic Church, but its ripple effects would extend far beyond his reign. Henry's creation of the Church of England in 1534 redefined the relationship between church and state. No longer was the Pope the spiritual head of English Christians. The monarch now claimed that supreme authority. This act, while initially political, laid the groundwork for a distinct English religious tradition that blended old rituals with new governance. The dissolution of monasteries not only redistributed wealth, but also dismantled centuries-old centers of religious life. Monks and nuns were expelled, libraries destroyed, and abbeys turned to ruin or secular estates. This abrupt upheaval forced communities to realign their spiritual routines around parish churches and state-approved clergy. Under Edward VI, England experienced its first true wave of Protestant reform. Latin was replaced by English in church services, images of saints were removed, and the Book of Common Prayer was introduced. These changes aimed to make worship accessible, personal, and aligned with Reformed theology rather than Catholic tradition. However, religious shifts were far from smooth or unanimous. When Mary the Fury ascended the throne, she sought to reverse the Protestant tide and restore Roman Catholicism. Her brutal persecution of Protestant reformers, known as the Marian Burnings, scarred the national memory and intensified religious polarization. Elizabeth I's succession marked the start of a cautious but enduring religious compromise. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 sought to unite the kingdom under a broad, inclusive Church of England. This church retained certain Catholic rituals but was governed by Protestant doctrine and monarchical control. The settlement required uniformity in outward practice but allowed some flexibility in private belief. This pragmatic approach helped avoid the full-scale religious wars that tore apart much of continental Europe. It also fostered a national consciousness centered on shared worship and loyalty to the sovereign, not the papacy. The role of clergy changed dramatically under the Tudors. No longer monastic or beholden to Rome, priests now owed their allegiance to the crown and served as community leaders, teachers, and state informants. Their sermons reinforced obedience, moral discipline, and national unity, ideas critical to Tudor governance. Religious reform also brought about new educational institutions. Grammar schools promoted reading so children could access the Bible, reinforcing Protestant values. Universities adapted curricula to reflect theological debates, producing clergy and scholars aligned with state doctrine. Art, literature, and music reflected and reinforced religious changes. Church interiors became simpler, but sacred music evolved into new forms, as seen in the works of composers like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. Literature, especially religious tracts and sermons, became central to public discourse and spiritual instruction. The printing press was instrumental in shaping religious identity. It allowed rapid dissemination of new theological ideas, state proclamations, and vernacular Bibles. This revolution in communication empowered laypeople to engage with Scripture directly, encouraging personal interpretation and moral accountability. Religious identity became increasingly tied to national identity. To be English meant to be loyal to the crown and aligned with its church. Foreign Catholics, especially the Spanish and the papacy, were often viewed as threats to national security and stability. This fusion of faith and patriotism intensified during the Spanish Armada crisis in 1588. The defense against Catholic Spain was framed not only as a military struggle but also a divine contest between Protestant truth and Catholic tyranny. Victory was interpreted as proof of God's favor upon Protestant England. Persecution continued under Elizabeth, but it was more targeted. Catholics and radical Puritans alike were suppressed if they posed political threats or refused to conform publicly. While private worship was tolerated to a degree, outward defiance invited surveillance, fines, or worse. Over time, the Tudor religious legacy laid the foundations for English religious pluralism and tolerance. Though the road was fraught with violence and division, the notion that the state could define religious norms while allowing some freedom of conscience endured. This model influenced later constitutional developments, including debates over church-state separation and religious freedom. Today, as Anglican Church, often described as a middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism, owes its form to Tudor compromise. The English tradition of balancing continuity with reform, central authority with personal faith, remains a hallmark of modern British religious culture. By anchoring national identity in a shared religious experience distinct from Rome, the Tudors helped forge a unified yet complex English self-image. The impact of Tudor religious policy continues to echo in the modern world. It shaped not only the Church of England but also broader ideas of citizenship, dissent, and individual belief within a national framework. Faith, under the Tudors, became not just a spiritual matter, but the very soul of the English nation. Part 9. The Rise of English Patriotism and National Identity. The Tudor period witnessed the powerful birth of English patriotism, a sentiment that would grow into the defining spirit of the nation. While earlier monarchs invoked loyalty to the crown, it was under the Tudors that the idea of being English took on deeper cultural, emotional, and political meaning. This evolving identity was shaped by military triumphs, religious divergence from Rome, and the emergence of a shared language and literature. Central to this rise was the rejection of foreign control, especially papal authority. The split from the Roman Catholic Church redefined English independence not just politically but spiritually and morally. People were taught to view their monarch not only as a political leader, but as the divine head of a distinct English church and way of life. The printing press played a vital role in strengthening this identity. Books, pamphlets, and sermons in English circulated widely, promoting national pride and fostering a collective consciousness. Access to printed materials unified the population through common language and shared narratives. One of the most influential developments was the standardization of the English language. Under the Tudors, English replaced Latin as the language of law, education, worship, and literature. This linguistic shift allowed the people to connect more closely with government, religion, and culture, reinforcing their shared identity. Literature became a vehicle of national expression and pride. Writers such as Edmund Spenser and later William Shakespeare infused their works with themes of English virtue, sovereignty, and destiny. These stories celebrated not only legendary figures, but also the values of courage, loyalty, and justice associated with Tudor rule. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked a defining moment in the growth of national pride. England's victory over a powerful Catholic empire was framed as a divine endorsement of its Protestant faith and national cause. This triumph inspired songs, plays, and chronicles that glorified the nation and elevated Elizabethan as a symbol of English greatness. Elizabethan pageantry and royal iconography further promoted patriotism. Portraits of the Queen emphasized her purity, wisdom, and connection to the land and its people. Public appearances and festivals were orchestrated to unite subjects in admiration and allegiance. Symbols of Englishness became central to everyday life. The red and white Tudor rose, the royal coat of arms, and the English Bible became potent emblems of national unity. These symbols helped ordinary citizens, from rural farmers to urban merchants, feel part of a larger, proud collective. Music and theater brought patriotism into the public square. Composers created stirring anthems celebrating the monarch and the nation, while playwrights staged dramas that celebrated England's past and projected its future glory. These cultural expressions served as emotional reinforcement of national solidarity. Education also became a tool for building patriotism. Grammar schools taught not only reading and writing, but also loyalty to the monarch and admiration for England as history and heroes. The Tudor state understood that fostering pride from an early age would ensure future generations of faithful subjects. Tudor nationalism was often shaped by contrasts with the other. The French, the Spanish, the Irish, and especially the Pope were portrayed as threats to English liberty and identity. This sense of external danger unified people under a common cause and reinforced internal cohesion. The notion of England as an island kingdom also fed into national mythology. The surrounding seas were seen as both a defense and a divine boundary, setting the English apart from and above their continental rivals. This geography fueled a belief in exceptionalism that would later influence imperial ambitions. Even fashion reflected national pride. Elizabethan sumptuary laws dictated what people could wear, reinforcing class and national hierarchy. Clothing became a way to show loyalty, with certain colors, fabrics, and symbols reflecting allegiance to the crown and the nation. English patriotism also found roots in law and governance. The idea of English liberties, freedoms granted by ancient custom and protected by the crown, was reinforced under Tudor rule. This legacy would influence later constitutional developments, including the Magna Carta's revival and debates on the rights of Englishmen. By the end of the Tudor era, being English was no longer simply a matter of geography or birth. It had become an identity shaped by common faith, shared language, national triumphs, and loyalty to a powerful monarch. This collective identity would persist and evolve through the centuries, laying the groundwork for the modern British nation-state. The Tudors gave England not just strong rulers, but a story to believe in. A story of divine favor, noble resistance, and destined greatness that united a people and forged a nation. And in doing so, they built the emotional and cultural foundation of English patriotism that still echoes today. Part 10. The Arts, Architecture, and Symbolism of Power. The Tudor dynasty understood the power of visual language in shaping public perception and reinforcing authority. Art, architecture, and courtly display were not simply aesthetic expressions. They were political tools designed to communicate strength, legitimacy, and divine right. From grand palaces to painted portraits, the Tudors mastered the art of visual symbolism to solidify their control and awe their subjects. Henry VII began this tradition subtly, using heraldry and careful iconography to assert his right to rule after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. He blended the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York to create the iconic Tudor rose, a symbol of unity and reconciliation. This floral emblem appeared on coins, tapestries, and manuscripts, embedding his dynastic claim into the fabric of daily life. Under Henry VIII, Tudor art reached unprecedented levels of grandeur and sophistication. Henry commissioned portraits that depicted him as a strong, almost godlike figure, broad-shouldered, commanding, and magnificently dressed. Hans Holbein the Younger. S. famous portrait of Henry remains one of the most enduring images of royal authority in European history. Architecture under Henry VIII served to glorify the monarchy and project imperial power. He constructed and expanded a series of opulent palaces including Hampton Court, Whitehall, and Nonsuch, which blended Gothic tradition with Renaissance innovation. These palaces were not only residences, they were stages for power, filled with grand halls, gilded ceilings, and intricate carvings that reflected royal majesty. Every element of Tudor design carried deeper meaning. Ceilings bore heraldic symbols. Walls displayed tapestries of myth and conquest, and stained glass windows illuminated the king's lineage and divine favor. This immersive visual world reminded every visitor, from noble to diplomat, of the unmatched authority of the English crown. Queen Elizabeth II elevated courtly spectacle to an art form in itself. Her reign saw the emergence of the cult of Gloriana, a mythologized version of herself as the Virgin Queen, eternally youthful, wise, and divinely chosen. Portraits of Elizabeth were carefully crafted, with subtle messages hidden in every detail, from pearls signifying purity to globes and scepters denoting global dominion. These images were widely distributed and closely controlled. Only approved portraits could be copied or circulated, ensuring that the monarch's image remained consistent, powerful, and inspiring. Elizabeth's portraits were less about realism and more about idealism, presenting not the woman, but the icon. Public spaces were transformed into arenas of royal propaganda. Progresses, the Queen's ceremonial tours through the countryside, were theatrical productions, complete with elaborate pageants, poetic tributes, and symbolic gifts. These events allowed ordinary people to witness the majesty of the monarch and feel part of the national narrative. Artisans and craftsmen flourished under Tudor patronage. Goldsmiths created jeweled ornaments that served as both fashion and political statements, while tailors and embroiderers produced garments rich in symbolic meaning. Court masks and theatrical productions used costume and stagecraft to dramatize Tudor greatness and moral authority. Architecture continued to evolve, drawing inspiration from Italian Renaissance principles while retaining English characteristics. The use of symmetry, classical columns and grand staircases signaled modernity and sophistication, aligning the Tudors with the leading powers of Europe. At the same time, elements such as timber-framed houses and oriel windows preserved a distinct English flavor. The dissolution of the monasteries brought a dramatic transformation of the architectural landscape. Religious houses were dismantled, and their materials were repurposed for private homes and royal estates. This redistribution of church wealth allowed a new class of nobles and gentry to build stately homes that echoed royal tastes and cemented their loyalty. Symbolism even extended to coins, medals, and seals. Royal portraits appeared on currency, reinforcing the ruler's omnipresence in everyday transactions. Seals, used in official documents, bore intricate designs that signified lineage, justice, and divine right, lending legal weight to every decree. The arts under the Tudors were inseparable from power. They were not only expressions of culture, but instruments of persuasion, loyalty, and fear. Through calculated visual language, the Tudors told a story of unbroken rule, heavenly favor, and a glorious destiny for England. These traditions left a lasting legacy. Modern royal imagery, from official portraits to coronation ceremonies, still draws on Tudor precedents of spectacle and symbolism. Public architecture, from Parliament to Buckingham Palace, continues the practice of blending function with grandeur. Tudor contributions to the arts shaped not only the aesthetics of their time, but also the political messaging of future centuries. They understood that power, once seen, is more easily believed. And through brush, stone, and symbol, they crafted a vision of monarchy that endures to this day. Part 11. Lasting legal reforms and the Tudor roots of British democracy. The Tudors were more than monarchs. They were architects of legal evolution that shaped the foundation of British democracy. Through legislative reforms, expansion of the judiciary, and consolidation of royal authority under law, they created structures that still influence modern governance. Though absolute in appearance, the Tudor monarchy laid the groundwork for a constitutional balance that would come to define England in the centuries that followed. Henry VII began this transformation with a clear objective: strengthen the monarchy without provoking rebellion. After the instability of the Wars of the Roses, he recognized that justice had to appear fair, predictable, and centralized. He revived the Court of Star Chamber, a tribunal designed to handle matters of public disorder and abuses by the nobility. This court was unique in that it bypassed the traditional jury system. It allowed the Crown to deliver swift and often harsh justice, particularly against those who threatened royal authority. Though controversial, it served to check the power of powerful aristocrats and enhance the image of a just, orderly realm. Henry VIII further extended legal control, particularly through his dramatic break with the Catholic Church. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared the king the supreme head of the Church of England, severing papal influence and placing ecclesiastical law under royal jurisdiction. This not only redefined the relationship between church and state, but also expanded the king's legislative reach into spiritual matters. A series of other acts followed, including the Treason Acts and the Act of Succession. These laws reinforced the authority of Parliament as the mechanism through which the king's will became enforceable. Despite his reputation for tyranny, Henry VIII relied heavily on statute law, signaling a transition from rule by decree to rule through institutional framework. Under Edward VI and Mary IV, the legal system continued to expand in complexity. Though brief, Edward's reign introduced Protestant doctrines into English law, while Mary's re-Catholicization created intense legal upheaval. These rapid shifts exposed the vulnerabilities of a system too tightly bound to the monarch's personal beliefs. It was Elizabeth I who refined and stabilized the Tudor legal legacy. Her long reign brought consistency and greater reliance on legal advisors, notably Sir William Cecil and Sir Francis Walsingham. She used Parliament more strategically, convening it when necessary to secure funding or legitimacy, but never surrendering control. The Elizabethan settlement, especially the 1559 Acts of Uniformity and Supremacy, ensured a middle path between religious extremes. These laws codified the Church of England's independence while enforcing outward conformity, balancing state control with relative social tolerance. This delicate legal equilibrium helped avoid the religious wars plaguing Europe and nurtured a uniquely English form of governance. Tudor legal reforms also laid the foundations of common law as a national institution. Local courts were strengthened, itinerant justices brought royal law to rural areas, and the precedence of case law over feudal customs became increasingly accepted. Judges began recording decisions that could guide future rulings, a key development in the evolution of precedent-based justice. One major achievement was the emergence of the legal profession as an independent class. Lawyers, trained at the Inns of Court, developed skills in advocacy, record-keeping, and legal interpretation. This professionalism helped insulate law from royal whim and created an enduring legal culture rooted in reasoning rather than royal fiat. The Tudor period also witnessed the institutional growth of Parliament. Although monarchs tightly controlled its functions, its increasing use for legislative endorsement planted the seeds of representative government. Tudor monarchs understood that laws ratified by Parliament carried more legitimacy, even if the chamber's freedom was still limited. Taxation became a particularly important area of parliamentary involvement. Rather than imposing levies unilaterally, Tudor monarchs frequently sought parliamentary approval, reinforcing the idea that taxation required consent. This principle would later become central in the English Civil War and the development of constitutional monarchy. Importantly, the Tudors began to shift the concept of sovereignty from a purely personal authority to an institutional framework. Though kings and queens ruled with immense power, they increasingly did so through councils, courts, and law codes. This subtle shift paved the way for later debates on liberty, limits on monarchy, and parliamentary supremacy. Tudor justice was not without flaws. Courts could be brutal, punishment severe, and dissent often silenced. But in forging a more centralized and legally consistent state, the Tudors initiated a transition toward law-based rule rather than personality-driven governance. That shift remains at the core of modern democratic systems in Britain and its former colonies. Today's British legal system, with its emphasis on precedent, statutory interpretation, and parliamentary lawmaking, echoes Tudor innovations. The balance between state power and individual rights, still debated in courts and legislatures, can trace its early struggles to the 16th century. From constitutional documents to judicial review, modern Britain still bears the mark of Tudor pragmatism and legal ingenuity. The legacy of Tudor law is not confined to dusty archives or ancient texts. It lives in the rights of citizens, the functioning of courts, and the enduring belief that even the most powerful leaders must answer to the rule of law. It is a quiet but profound inheritance, an invisible framework that supports the visible pillars of British democracy. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Tudor legacy and its modern influence. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more riveting history content. Share your thoughts below. How do you see Tudor traditions in today's world? Until next time, stay curious and stay historical.